A retired Navy SEAL thought he was only taking his old dog for one last quiet walk near Black Alder. Then the dog froze beneath a storm-soaked oak tree and started digging like a man's life still depended on it. What came out of the mud was a silver locket buried for 30 years, and a photograph that should not exist. In that single image stood a missing man, a rising officer, and the first crack in a military legend. Before sunrise, a dead friend's silence, an old dog's loyalty, and one buried secret would pull Dane back into the war he thought was over. Because the truth was never lost. It was hidden, and someone had just realized it was about to be found. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and if this story stays with you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. By late October, the abandoned edge of Black Alder always smelled like wet cedar, rust, and old salt. Dane Calloway had come to like that smell more than he trusted most people. At 34, Dane stood a shade over 6 feet, with the quiet, weathered build of a man shaped by use rather than display. Nothing about him looked ornamental. His strength sat low and practical in his shoulders and back, in the easy balance of a man who had carried too much weight for too long. His face was clean-shaven, the square line of his jaw left bare to the cold, his cheekbones sharp enough to make him seem harder than he was. Dark brown hair, clipped short in the old military way, though slightly longer than regulations would have liked, lay flattened beneath a faded knit cap. The northern wind had worked its mark into his skin over the years, leaving it fair but roughened, touched by cold and salt, until he looked more like a man born to piers and gray water than a former Navy SEAL. Only his eyes gave the rest away. Gray-blue, steady, almost colorless in certain light, they had the habit of looking through a thing before they looked at it. He lived in a small cabin near the coastal training grounds, where the road narrowed into gravel and memory. It was not much of a place, but it held together the way some men did, quietly, without asking for sympathy. The porch sagged on the left side. The storm windows rattled when the wind turned. A chipped enamel bowl sat beside the door, filled fresh every morning, whether the dog drank from it or not. Bishop did. Bishop was a 5-year-old German shepherd with a yellow and black coat gone darker along the spine and muzzle. The kind of dog whose stillness carried more force than another creature's noise. He had the deep chest and hard shoulders of a working-line shepherd, ears sharp and upright, amber-brown eyes that always seemed to be measuring the truth of a room. He belonged to Cole Thorne once. Now, in the awkward and faithful way grief rearranged the living, he belonged to Dane. Cole had been dead 4 months. His picture still sat on the shelf above the sink, wedged between a cracked field compass and a jar of screws Dane never threw out. Cole had been 35, broad-smiled and hard-headed, with sandy hair that never lay flat, and the kind of open face people trusted too fast. That had been his gift and his weakness. He believed in people longer than they deserved. Even in the photo, taken on some bright day neither of them had known would matter later, Cole looked like a man halfway through a joke. Sometimes Dane caught himself turning to say something toward that shelf. Sometimes Bishop did too. The dog had aged since Cole's funeral, not in years, but in the small humiliations the body kept count of when the heart could not. He climbed the porch steps more slowly now. He slept harder. His hips stiffened on damp mornings. And yet there were moments, usually in the hour before dusk, when he would lift his head with eerie precision and stare toward the tree line as if a command had traveled across time and found him anyway. That afternoon, Rain had only just passed. The world outside the cabin glistened under a lid of low gray sky. Water still slid from pine needles. The earth had opened itself to the weather and turned dark, almost black in places. Dane took Bishop out along the old perimeter trail because routine was sometimes the only mercy a man could afford himself. Black Alder had once been a live training site. Sealed sections, offshore drills, logistics sheds, command structures, all of it. Now most of it sat empty, fenced, or half consumed by scrub and salt air. In another month, construction crews would begin converting the southern grounds into a memorial and leadership center named after Admiral Hollis Brenner. Even thinking the name pulled something complicated through Dane's chest. Hollis Brenner had saved his life 12 years earlier during an operation in the Gulf. Dane remembered blood in his mouth, seawater in his lungs, and Brenner's hand locked around the back of his plate carrier while rounds cracked overhead. Some debts did not fade with time. They settled into bone. To Dane, Brenner was not just a decorated officer. He was one of the last clean pillars left standing in a world that had lost too many. Bishop stopped. Not the loose paws of a dog distracted by scent. This was sharper. His whole body tightened. His head angled toward the woods east of the trail, toward a patch of ground near a cluster of survey stakes strung with bright orange tape. "What is it?" Dane asked. Bishop did not look back. Then, with a suddenness that made Dane swear under his breath, the dog lunged off the path and dragged the leash taut through wet brush and low fern. Dane followed, boots slipping in mud, branches catching at his sleeves. "Bishop!" The shepherd ignored him. He drove straight toward an old oak that leaned slightly over a washed-out rise, its trunk huge and misshapen, bark thick as broken armor. The ground around it was soft from rain. Bishop hit the base of the tree and began to dig. At first, Dane thought it was an animal burrow. The dog worked in fierce, jerking motions, front legs pumping, mud flinging back against his belly and Dane's pant legs. But this was not hunting behavior. There was urgency in it, something almost offended. "Enough," Dane said, sharper now. Bishop let out a low sound deep in his throat and kept going. Dane stepped closer, ready to haul him off by the collar, and then stopped. The earth was loose in a way rain alone did not explain. Not just softened, disturbed. A shallow ring around the roots had been turned over recently, then pushed back badly, the way a man in a hurry might hide his own tracks and trust the weather to finish the job. There were scrape marks where a tool had caught rootwood. One corner of the mud held the clean edge of a boot print, already blurring under runoff, but still newer than it should have been. Dane felt the first thin wire of unease draw tight inside him. Bishop struck something small and hard beneath the dirt. Metal, by the sound of it. He froze, paw hovering. Then he looked up at Dane. It was such a brief look, yet it changed the air between them. Not because the dog understood what they had found, but because he seemed to know it mattered. Dane crouched and used both hands to clear the mud away. His fingers closed around a small silver locket, blackened with age, its hinge stiff and rim packed with dirt. It was cold enough to sting his skin. He wiped it against his sleeve and turned it over. No inscription, no initials, just weight. For a moment, he nearly pocketed it and left. That would have been the sane thing. Instead, he worked the edge open with the tip of his knife until the clasp gave with a tiny metallic crack. Inside was a photograph, folded once and protected behind a warped clear seal that had somehow held. Dane brought it closer to the gray light. Three men stood side by side under a strip lamp outside what looked like a coastal equipment shed. One was young Hollis Brenner, 40 maybe, taller than, broad through the shoulders, with the hard, composed face of a man who had learned early how to wear authority like a second skin. Even younger, he had that same disciplined stillness, that same steel-blue gaze that made weaker men straighten without knowing why. The second man was civilian, mid-40s, trim beard, expensive field jacket. The logo stitched over the chest read Calder Frost. The third man made Dane's breath catch. Gabriel Thorne. He knew the face from the old family pictures Cole kept in a shoebox, though those photos had shown Gabriel younger and easier, laughing at a cookout or kneeling beside a bike one of his children had not yet learned to ride. Here he looked different. 36, maybe. Leaner, tired around the mouth, clean-shaven like his son had been, with dark hair, wind-pushed back, and eyes that seemed fixed on something just beyond the frame. Gabriel had been officially listed as missing after a training incident 30 years earlier. Unofficially, the word that survived him had been uglier. Run. Deserted. Coward. Cole had never said those words aloud. He did not have to. Dane had heard them in the spaces around his name. But that was not what sent the cold through him. It was the background. Behind the men stood a row of low warehouse buildings with corrugated roofs and floodlight poles. Dane had walked Black Alder's public maps, old training plans, and decommission records more than once over the years. That annex was not on any of them, a place that should not exist. His pulse slowed in the dangerous way it did when his mind began to move faster than his body. He turned the photograph over. On the back, almost washed away with time, was a line written in hurried block letters. If I don't make it, ask Delaney about Tide B. A wind moved through the trees then, thin and cold, bringing the smell of wet bark and turned soil. Dane stared at the writing. His first instinct was refusal, not fear exactly, something older, more stubborn. The refusal to let one wrong detail drag a whole past behind it. There had to be an explanation. A buried keepsake, a private meeting, a map he had never seen. Brenner had served long enough to exist in places that did not make the papers. Gabriel could have been assigned there unofficially. Men disappeared into classified work all the time. That did not mean... Bishop's head snapped toward the deeper woods. Every hair along his shoulders lifted. He was no longer digging. He was listening. Dane rose slowly, photo still in hand. The woods had gone too quiet. Rainwater dripped from branch tips. Somewhere farther off, a gull cried over the coast. But closer, very close, something had just moved and then stopped moving. Who's there? Nothing. He took 2 steps toward the tree line, and Bishop moved with him, body low, gaze fixed. Dane saw no one. Still, the feeling came over him with a certainty he had learned not to ignore in other places, harsher places. Somebody had been standing out there, watching long enough to know exactly what he had opened. He did not chase. Chasing into unfamiliar brush with fading light and a stiffening dog was how pride got men hurt. Instead, he backed away slowly, slipping the photograph and locket into the inside pocket of his olive tactical shirt, where the old fabric had gone soft from years of washing and weather. Mud darkened the worn knees of his moss-green combat pants. Rain clung to his old military boots. All at once he felt absurdly visible, like the whole forest had turned its face toward him. Halfway back to the trail, Bishop stopped again. He looked over his shoulder at the oak, then at Dane, then back at the oak. There was no drama in it, no mysticism, just one last insistence, so Dane went back. This time he studied the ground instead of the tree. The loose soil, the scrape marks, the broken root, a fragment of wet orange survey ribbon caught under a clod. And there, pressed near the far side where Bishop had not dug, the heel mark of a work boot with fresh red clay packed into the tread. Red clay. There was none of that in the natural soil here. It came from the graded southern lot, the future site of the Brenner Center. Something small shifted in Dane then. Not belief. Belief would have been simpler. This was worse. It was the first hairline crack in a loyalty he had carried for years, like a load-bearing beam. By the time he and Bishop reached the cabin, dusk had dropped over Black Alder. Dane shut the door, dried the dog, fed him, and stood for a long time at the kitchen table without removing his jacket. The locket lay open under the yellow cone of a single hanging bulb. Brenner's younger face looked up at him from the photograph, composed and unreadable. Gabriel Thorne stood 3 inches away from him, alive in a place he should not have been, before disappearing into 30 years of rumor and shame. Bishop settled by the door, but he did not sleep. He kept his head up, ears half forward, as though waiting for the sound of something returning. Dane touched the edge of the photograph with one rough finger. For the first time, a thought entered him that he could not push back out. What he had found under that oak was not an old secret accidentally uncovered by rain. It might be something somebody had come back for and failed to retrieve by only a matter of minutes. Dane did not sleep enough to call it sleep. By morning, the rain had thinned into a pale mist that clung low over the road and the scrub pines beyond it. The locket sat on his kitchen table beside a cold cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. He had opened it a dozen times before sunrise, each time hoping the photograph would look less impossible in daylight. It never did. Bishop lay near the door, chin on his paws, watching Dane with the grave patience dogs sometimes had when they knew a human was circling something painful and would not step into it yet. Dane finally took the truck and drove inland to Mara Thorne's house. Mara lived in the kind of weather-beaten place that looked as if wind had been testing it for years and had not yet won. She was 38, tall enough to carry herself with a spare kind of strength, though grief had thinned her more than time had. Her hair was chestnut brown, usually tied low at the nape in a way that suggested convenience rather than vanity. Her skin was fair but tired, the kind that seemed to hold sleepless nights just beneath it. She had hazel eyes like Cole's, but where Cole's had once opened easily toward people, Mara's had learned restraint. Life had made her practical before it had made her soft. She opened the door still wearing an old charcoal sweater and jeans, one hand wrapped around a dish towel. When she saw Dane standing there with Bishop at his side, something in her face tightened before she said a word. "You look like you brought bad weather with you," she said. "Maybe I did." That was enough for her. She stepped aside. The house still carried traces of Cole in the cruel, ordinary ways that were hardest to bear. A pair of boots by the mudroom wall, a baseball cap on a hook, a tool magazine folded on the end table. Dane had seen death in uglier forms than absence, but absence lasted longer. Mara noticed the locket the moment he laid it on the dining table. She did not touch it first. She looked at Dane instead, as if trying to decide whether he already understood what he was asking her to look at. When she finally opened it, she did not gasp. She went very still. Her thumb hovered over Gabriel's face in the photograph without quite landing on it. For a moment, she was not 38 anymore. She was something younger, wounded in a place that had never scarred properly. "My mother kept one picture of him in the kitchen drawer," she said quietly. "Not on the wall. Never on the wall. Just in the drawer under the pot holders, like she was ashamed of being seen remembering him." Dane said nothing. Mara kept staring at the photograph. That was how it worked. Nobody came out and said he ran. Nobody had to. They just looked at us the wrong way for years. People get very elegant when they want to be cruel without having to hear themselves do it. She lifted her eyes. "Where did you find this?" Dane told her. Not every detail. Not the part about the feeling in the woods, or the cold certainty that someone had been there. He spoke in the careful, practical way men often used when they were afraid that too much emotion might make a thing sound less true. Mara listened without interrupting. When he was done, she leaned back in her chair and folded the dish towel slowly between her hands. "Cole was looking into black alder before he died," she said. Dane frowned. "He never told me that." "No, he didn't." There was no accusation in her voice yet, which somehow made it worse. "He told me enough to know it wasn't casual. He said he'd found a few things that didn't line up. Small things, dates, missing records, a name that kept disappearing and reappearing where it shouldn't." Dane felt irritation rise first, because it was easier to manage than hurt. "Then why didn't he bring it to me?" Mara gave him a long look. "Maybe because he knew exactly what name sat at the center of it." That landed where she meant it to. Dane looked away. Brenner. Even inside his own head, the name carried weight. He tried to bring reason back into the room. This could still mean something else. Gabriel might have been there for some side operation. The buildings could have been temporary. The writing on the back might connect to a personal matter. Not what? Mara asked. Her voice stayed level, but it had acquired an edge fine enough to cut with. Not something big enough to make you uncomfortable? Dane's jaw tightened. Mara stood and went to the window over the sink. When she spoke again, her tone had softened, but only because softness sometimes carried truth better than anger. Cole joined up because he wanted to be his own man. That's the clean version. The uglier version is that he spent his whole life trying to outrun a question with our father's name attached to it. She turned back toward him. So I'll ask you the thing he probably didn't. Her hazel eyes held his. Are you afraid of the truth, Dane? Or are you afraid of the name inside it? He had no answer that did not sound like surrender. Bishop, who had been pacing near the kitchen doorway, crossed suddenly to an old cedar chest beneath the staircase and stopped. He lowered his head, touched the lid once with his nose, then looked at Mara. She frowned. What is it? The chest contained some of Cole's things she had not been able to sort through. Mara knelt, lifted the lid, and paused. Inside, under a folded thermal shirt and an old challenge coin, sat a neat bundle of envelopes tied with faded string. All of them were addressed to federal records offices, military archives, and legal review boards. All of them were either returned, denied, or never answered. Cole had kept every single one. For a moment, nobody spoke. That small stack of paper hurt more than the photograph, because it was not mystery. It was effort. Quiet, stubborn effort. The sort a man makes when he no longer expects justice, only clarification. Mara touched the top envelope with 2 fingers, as if it might burn. He did try, she said. He just didn't know where to get in. That was the moment something inside Dane shifted from resistance to obligation. Not belief, not yet, but obligation. By noon, he was on his way to the NCIS field office with the photograph, the locket, and 2 of Cole's unopened records requests in an evidence envelope he had bought from a hardware store because he did not know what else to do with his hands. Special Agent Nora Keats received him in a glass-walled interview room that smelled faintly of printer toner and old coffee. She was 41, slim without delicacy, her posture straight in the economical way of someone who disliked wasted motion. Her dark brown hair was cut to brush her shoulders and tucked neatly behind one ear. Her face was angular, composed, not unfriendly, but built to discourage easy assumptions. Gray-blue eyes, cool and searching, missed little. She wore a charcoal turtleneck under a dark blazer, no jewelry except a steel watch and a wedding band that looked long accustomed to being turned rather than admired. Nora listened to Dane the way a surgeon listened to symptoms, without interruption, without visible sympathy, without any of the false reassurance people used when they wanted to be liked. When she finally examined the photograph and locket beneath a task lamp, her expression changed by degrees rather than all at once. "This sealant is period correct," she said. "Late 90s, maybe slightly earlier. The photo paper, too. The ink on the reverse has aged naturally." She glanced up. "So unless someone staged a very expensive fake for reasons I cannot yet imagine, this object is not new." Dane exhaled once through his nose. "That said," Nora went on, "old does not automatically mean conclusive. A real object can still be misleading." "Understood." "I'm not taking official custody yet," she said. "Not until I can open a proper channel and document transfer. If I take it now without a case number, it becomes a chain of custody headache for everybody." She slid it back toward him. "Keep it on you or locked down. No copies left lying around." That choice, practical as it was, would matter later. Before Dane left, Nora made one call and sent him to an archival trailer near the redevelopment offices at Black Alder. If there was any truth to the structures in the background, she wanted a civilian records specialist to look first before military channels began closing doors. Evelyn Shaw met him there. She was in her late 50s, slight and narrow-shouldered, with short brown-gray hair and a cardigan the soft blue of worn paper. Her face had the careful, faded kindness of a woman who had spent many years handling the past for other people and had learned that memory could cut as sharply as anything made of metal. She wore thin reading glasses low on her nose and spoke gently, though her hands moved with quick, nervous efficiency. When Dane set the photograph in front of her, she adjusted the lamp, leaned close, and frowned. "Wait," she murmured. Her finger hovered near the edge of one of the floodlight poles in the background. Then she turned to a terminal, pulled up an old utilities overlay, and began scrolling. Dane watched her expression change from concentration to unease. "What is it?" he asked. "There used to be a secondary designation in the coastal annex system," Evelyn said. "A service cluster not shown on any public maps after the site was downsized. Power, drainage, emergency wash lines." She swallowed. "Hangar 12. The words sat between them. "It existed?" Dane asked. Her eyes stayed on the screen. "Apparently, at least on infrastructure routing. But the matching structural drawings are gone." She clicked through another file, then another, finding nothing. Not misfiled. Gone. Dane thought of Gabriel's face, Brenner's face, the civilian from Calder Frost. Evelyn looked up at him, and for the first time there was genuine alarm in her voice. "Mr. Calloway, places do not vanish from records by accident. Not like that." By the time he drove home, evening had dropped hard and fast. The cabin felt smaller than usual. Dane locked the locket inside the kitchen drawer beneath a folded dish towel and an old map case. It was a poor hiding place, but it was the sort desperate men overlooked because it looked too ordinary to matter. Bishop would not settle. He paced from window to window, pausing at the back door more than once. Dane checked the porch, the truck, the line of trees behind the cabin. Nothing. At 1 a.m, glass ticked softly somewhere in the dark. Dane was awake before he knew why. Bishop was already moving. There was no bark at first, only the hard scrape of claws on floorboards and the low, violent growl of a dog who had made up his mind. Dane came out of the bedroom barefoot, hand on the pistol from his nightstand, just in time to see a shadow by the kitchen. The intruder had gloves on, hood up, face covered. He was not rummaging wildly. He was checking specific places: drawer, shelf, bread tin, cabinet above the sink. The kind of search that meant he knew exactly what sort of object he wanted, and roughly where a man like Dane might hide it. Then his hand landed on the kitchen drawer. Bishop launched. The man staggered sideways with a strangled curse, slammed into the counter, and tore the curtain half off the window as he twisted free. Dane lunged too late to catch him. By the time he reached the back porch, the figure was already vanishing into black timber beyond the yard. No money taken, no gun missing, no electronics touched. Just the drawer hanging open and the dish towel on the floor. By dawn, Nora Keats was standing in his kitchen, taking in the mess with a face gone flatter and colder than before. Whatever skepticism she had held on to yesterday was gone now, or at least forced to make room for urgency. "If someone was willing to come in here for one old object," she said, "then that object was never dead history." Bishop stood by the torn back curtain, nose working the threshold. Then he lowered his head toward the mud tracked just inside the door. One print was deeper than the rest where the intruder had pivoted under the dog's weight. A broken smear of red clay clung to the edge of the heel. Nora crouched beside him. Dane felt it before she spoke. "That color doesn't belong to the natural soil around your cabin," she said. No. He knew where it did belong. Down on the graded southern lot. The one freshly cut and packed for the foundations of the new memorial site. The future Hollis Brenner Center. Bishop lifted his head and looked toward the window, toward the direction of black alder, as if the scent had drawn a line through the morning and he could already see where it ended. Dane followed the dog's gaze, and this time, he did not try to explain the feeling away. Nora Keats had a way of slowing a room down without raising her voice. By the second morning after the break-in, she had already made one thing painfully clear to Dane. Whatever was happening, he was not going to charge through it like a man kicking open a breach. He was going to document, wait, compare, verify. That restraint irritated him more than he wanted to admit, mostly because part of him knew she was right. Improvisation saved lives in the field. It also ruined cases on land. They met in the parking lot outside the county records annex just after 8. The sky was low and white, the kind that seemed less like weather and more like a lid placed over the world. Bishop remained in the truck at first, watching through the rear window with that steady amber gaze of his, ears alert, chest still. Nora stood beside her sedan in a charcoal coat, a folder tucked beneath one arm. In the daylight, she looked even more controlled than she had in the office. Her dark hair was pinned back this time, exposing a face made sharper by fatigue rather than softened by it. She did not waste gestures. Even her sympathy, when it appeared at all, arrived in measured quantities. "I made a few calls," she said. "The name Delaney didn't give me one answer. It gave me 6. 4 are dead. One lives in Arizona and never served on the East Coast. The last one is local." "Frank Delaney," Dane said. Nora nodded once. "Former corpsman. Attached short-term to Black Alder support operations in the 90s. 72. 2 DU is in the past decade. Welfare checks on file. Neighbors describe him as quiet until he isn't. Meaning? Meaning trauma, alcohol, and age have all had a turn with him." Dane glanced toward his truck. "And if he doesn't remember? Then we don't force a memory to become a fact." Nora's eyes flicked toward him. "You understand the difference?" He did. He just did not like how often that difference protected the wrong people. Frank Delaney lived 20 minutes inland in a salt-bleached bungalow tucked behind a collapsing bait shed and a yard full of things nobody had the energy to throw away. A rusted anchor lay half-buried in weeds. So did a broken lawn chair, a cracked cooler, and the skeleton of an old skiff slowly sinking into grass. Frank answered the door after a long delay. He had the thin, unfinished look of a man whom time had been nibbling at for years. Tall once, perhaps, though age had folded him down into himself. His shoulders sloped unevenly beneath a red-gray flannel shirt gone shiny at the elbows. Wisps of silver hair clung to his scalp, and gray stubble mottled his jaw in patches that suggested he still intended to shave, just not every day. His eyes were pale blue and watery, but not empty. They moved with the raw caution of someone who had forgotten many things and knew it. "What?" he asked. Nora did the talking. Dane noticed that she did not identify herself with the hard edge of federal authority. She softened nothing, but she left room for the man's pride. Frank let them in after a hesitation that felt less suspicious than tired. The inside of the house smelled of mildew, aspirin, and stale bourbon. Medical journals were stacked beside fishing magazines. A blood pressure cuff hung from the back of a chair. On the mantel sat one framed photo turned face down. Frank lowered himself into a recliner with the deliberate care of a man who no longer trusted his knees. His gaze drifted to Bishop, who had remained near the doorway and was now watching him without a sound. "Dog's military," Frank muttered. "Yes," Dane said. Frank nodded as if that confirmed something private. When Nora placed the photograph from the locket on the table, Frank did not touch it immediately. He stared at it from a distance first. Then his hand came forward, trembling so badly the nail of his forefinger clicked against the paper. His breathing changed. Not deeper. Smaller. Dane saw it happen in real time. That terrible moment when a person did not need to decide whether they recognized the past, because the past had already recognized them. "Where did you get this?" Frank whispered. "Black Alder," Nora said. "Near the old coastal grounds." Frank closed his eyes. For a second, Dane thought the old man might refuse, or collapse inward the way some people did when memory arrived too fast. Instead, he leaned back and stared at the water-stained ceiling. "It rained that night," he said. No one interrupted him. It wasn't supposed to be anything but a containment drill. Inventory transfer, seal the route, log the movement, sign it over. That was the clean version. He opened his eyes again. Then a truck showed up that wasn't on the manifest. Dane felt his neck tighten. Frank's voice did not run in a straight line. It snagged, doubled back, wandered. but the images in it were too particular to dismiss. "Crates," Frank said. "Heavy, wrong markings. Not Navy issue. I remember because one split a corner getting unloaded. Gabriel saw it too." His gaze shifted to the photograph. He started asking questions before anybody else decided whether to pretend not to notice. "Who was there?" Nora asked quietly. Frank swallowed. "Brenner, the contractor. Gabriel, a few others. Men from support detail." He rubbed his thumb against the armrest as if feeling grit there. "I heard arguing later, near the Tide Annex. Voices carrying through the sheet metal. Did you hear what was said?" "Not all of it." Frank shut his eyes again. "Something about reporting outside command. Something about chain of custody. Gabriel kept saying this wasn't something you buried in-house." Dane stared at the floorboards, because the alternative was to picture Hollis Brenner exactly as he had always pictured him. Composed, capable, certain. A man who had once dragged him bleeding toward the rotor wash of a helicopter and cursed him back into consciousness. That memory stood up in him now like a witness for the defense. Frank's next words came out slower. "There was a phrase I remember because it didn't belong in a training night. Hold him until transfer." He opened his eyes and fixed them on Dane with sudden, painful clarity. "I heard that. I know I heard that." The room seemed to contract. Dane lifted his head. "You're saying Gabriel was in custody?" "I'm saying he was alive." Frank's throat worked. "At least after the incident they claimed took him." That sentence landed harder than anything else had. For 30 years, Gabriel Thorne had existed in Black Alder's memory as a disappearance. A gap. A shame. Not a detained man. Not a witness. Not someone still breathing after the time the records said he was gone. Frank pressed the heel of his hand into one eye. There was a med truck near dawn. White body, red stripe. I remember because the tires spun in mud and I thought, idiots, they'll wake the whole site. I saw 2 men in rain gear loading someone. Didn't see a face, but I saw boots dragging. Nora kept her voice even. "Can you place Brenner in that sequence?" Frank's jaw shook. "I can place him there that night. More than once, but the rest..." He looked ashamed, which was somehow worse than confusion. "Memory ain't a clean room, Agent. Mine sure as hell isn't." Bishop, who had not moved for nearly 10 minutes, rose and crossed the room. He stopped in front of the mantel where the face-down photograph sat. Then, very gently, he nosed it upright. It showed Frank as a younger man in Navy medical greens, standing beside 2 corpsmen and a lanky civilian volunteer on a dock. Nothing dramatic. No hidden gun. No obvious clue. Except for the far left edge. There, half cut off by the frame, stood a man in the background wearing a rain poncho and holding a clipboard. His face was mostly shadowed, but Frank made a sound in his throat and leaned forward so quickly the recliner groaned. "That coat," he said. Nora looked at the photo. "You know it?" Frank nodded once, hard. "Not the man. The coat. Tide B issue. Temporary storm gear they only kept at the annex." The room went quiet again, but differently this time. Not with uncertainty. With the sick little click of another piece finding its place. After that, Frank tired quickly. Memory had wrung him out. He began repeating himself, then slipping sideways into unrelated fragments about triage tents and a boy with a broken collarbone on some other year's exercise. Nora knew when to stop. Before leaving, she asked one final question. "Did Gabriel die that night?" Frank stared at his own hands for a long time. No, he said at last. Not then. Outside, the day had gone colder. Dane stood by the truck with one hand on the doorframe, looking out toward the marsh road, as if the landscape itself might explain what to do with that answer. Mara called before they had even left the driveway. Dane put her on speaker. Her voice came quick, controlled only by force. I found receipts in Cole's storage box. Gas, motel, diner tabs, Black Alder dates. Nora's head turned at once. How many trips? Dane asked. 5 that I can prove. Maybe more. Mara took a breath. He was coming out there without telling me. Without telling you. Dane leaned his forehead briefly against the cold metal of the truck roof. That hurt in a place he had not protected. Not because Cole had lied. Cole had always kept certain burdens private until he had words for them. It hurt because Dane understood the instinct too well. Men could carry fear like contraband, especially when naming it might crack the shape of someone they still needed to believe in. By late afternoon, Nora was back at the field office, prying at internal access channels that did not want prying. Dane waited in the hall with bad coffee and worse thoughts. Bishop slept at his boots, though every few minutes one ear flicked toward the elevators. That was where Evan Brenner found them. Evan was about 40, tall and well-kept in a way that came less from vanity than from habit. His hair, dark brown touched at the temples with the first clean threads of gray, was cut neat but not severe. He had his father's gray-blue eyes, though not the same steel in them. Where Hollis Brenner looked like a man who had long ago made peace with command, Evan looked like a man who had spent half his life learning how to stand inside another man's shadow without disappearing entirely. His navy coat was expensive. His expression was exhausted. "Mr. Calloway," he said quietly, "may I have a minute?" Dane stood. "How'd you know I was here?" Evan accepted the accusation without flinching. "Because my father's name is on a project half this county is talking about, and people tell people things." That was honest enough not to dismiss. They stepped outside under the awning. Wind moved across the parking lot in thin blades. Evan kept his hands in his coat pockets. "I'm not here to threaten you." "Good. I'm here because whatever this is, it is already hurting people who haven't done anything except belong to the wrong bloodline." Dane said nothing. Evan swallowed once before going on. "My father gave his life to the service. So did men who believed in him. So did men who followed him into places they don't speak about now because they can't." His voice stayed low, but strain began to show beneath it. "If you have a question, ask it. If you have an accusation, make it when you can prove it. But don't drag a half-formed suspicion into public and call it justice." There was no menace in him. That was what made him hard to hate. He looked, in that moment, less like a defender of corruption than a son trying to hold up the roof over his family with bare hands. "My father saved a lot of men," Evan said. "Maybe he saved you." Dane met his eyes. "He did." "Then please," Evan said, and the last word came out with more weariness than pride. "Make sure whatever you're doing is about truth and not grief looking for somewhere to land." He left before Dane could answer. An hour later, Nora called him into a secured room. Her face gave away nothing, but there was a charge in her stillness now. "I found an off-index retention file," she said. "Not in the main system. In a parallel archival queue used for temporary internal holds before transfer or purge." She slid a document across the table. It was a detention processing form. Partial. Water damaged. Retrieval stamp incomplete. Name: Gabriel Thorne. Status: held pending transfers. Time logged: 18 hours after official disappearance report. Dane stared until the words blurred. He felt something close over him then. Not panic, not rage, but the cold, airless pressure that came when a truth stopped being abstract and took on paper weight. Gabriel had not vanished into the sea when they said he had. He had been alive long enough to be processed. Dane's gaze dropped lower. Approval signature. Most of it had feathered away into an unreadable slope of ink. Not enough remained to swear to anything in court. Not enough, maybe, for Nora to say the name aloud, but enough for Dane. He knew that slanted, disciplined hand. Years earlier, Hollis Brenner had written a recommendation that helped move Dane into a specialized unit he had once thought was the proudest fact of his life. Dane still remembered studying the signature in silence after receiving it, not because ink mattered, but because being seen by a man like Brenner had felt like being measured and found worthy. Now he looked at the ruined approval line on Gabriel Thorne's detention form and felt that old gratitude turn inside itself. Not gone. Worse than gone. Complicated. Alive. He did not speak for several seconds. Nora watched him carefully. "Do you recognize something?" Dane kept his eyes on the paper. After a long moment, he answered, "Yes." That night, Dane drove farther than he needed to. He took the coastal road north until Black Alder disappeared behind dunes and rock, until the sea on his right turned from iron gray to nearly black. He parked above a pull-off where fishermen sometimes came at dawn, killed the engine, and sat with both hands on the wheel while Bishop breathed quietly in the back seat. There were years of his life he could walk through in perfect order even now. Every doorway, every burst of gunfire, every shouted coordinate, every mistake he had made and survived. But memory was a traitor in its own way. It preserved what it wanted. It polished some men and buried others. When he closed his eyes, he was back in Afghanistan. A blast had taken the world apart in pieces. Sand, blood, radio static, light. He remembered trying to stand and finding only half his body willing to obey. He remembered the taste of metal in his throat, and the weight of another man collapsed across his legs. And through all of it, he remembered Hollis Brenner moving against the pattern of fear rather than with it, not shouting from cover, not signaling someone else forward. Coming himself. Dragging Dane by the plate carrier, while rounds cracked overhead and dust spat up around them. There had been nothing hesitant in Brenner's face. No calculation. Just force, command, and the blunt refusal to leave his people where they fell. That memory had held up more than one broken thing inside Dane over the years. So what was he supposed to do with a detention form and a dead man's photograph? What was a man meant to do when gratitude and suspicion began living in the same room? Bishop shifted in the back and put his head between the front seats. Dane reached back and scratched the dog behind one ear. The shepherd leaned into the touch for a moment, then withdrew, his amber-brown eyes fixed on the windshield, as if the dark water beyond it contained something worth guarding. When Dane got home, there was a message waiting from Nora. Calls are slowing everything down. Internal review requests are being redirected. Do not mistake resistance for proof, but do not ignore it either. That was pure Nora, measured even when the ground was moving beneath her. By morning, the weather had changed. The clouds had broken enough to let cold light across the marsh, and wind came hard off the coast, with the sharp, clean smell that followed a storm front. Dane met Nora and Evelyn Shaw in one of the temporary site trailers at Black Alder, where maps had begun to colonize the walls. Evelyn looked paler than usual. In the daylight, her kindness seemed made of thinner material. She was a slight woman in her late 50s, with short brown-gray hair and the nervous, careful movements of someone who had spent a lifetime handling fragile things. Her cardigan today was a soft ash blue, the cuffs pulled a little loose from repeated tugging. She wore reading glasses low on her nose, but even without them, her eyes had the strained brightness of a person who had not slept enough. "I found something," she said, closing the trailer door behind them. Not a discovery announced with triumph, more like a confession. She unrolled a faded utility overlay across the table. Old conduit lines, drainage notes, service routes. The kind of map most people would look through rather than at. "This line here," she said, tapping with a pencil, "was labeled as emergency power for the annex cluster. It runs west for a few hundred yards, then breaks toward the low-tide shelf." She swallowed. There's no structure marked at the terminal point anymore. But the feed shouldn't have gone there unless something permanent once did. Nora leaned in. A shed? More than a shed. Possibly a boathouse or transfer station. The shoreline was different then. Evelyn hesitated. There are handwritten amendments on the original routing. Those are usually maintenance-level notes. But this one. She slid the sheet closer. In the margin, almost lost in pencil fade, were the words, "Tide access locked after incident." Dane felt Mara before he heard her. She stepped into the trailer behind him, cheeks bright from wind, her dark parka half-zipped, chestnut hair pulled back, but already coming loose around her temples. She had inherited something hard from grief, an economy of motion, a refusal to waste energy on performance. She looked from the map to Dane's face and understood enough without explanation. "Show me," she said. Nora straightened. "I'm not authorizing a search. Not yet." "You don't own the shoreline," Mara replied. "No," Nora said evenly. "But if you go digging on federal redevelopment property and contaminate something, you'll hand whoever wants this buried a gift." Dane expected the argument to swell there. Instead, it narrowed. Evelyn spoke quietly. "The terminal point is beyond the current fence extension. Erosion shifted the boundary years ago. Technically, it's outside the active construction footprint." Nora looked at her. Evelyn did not look away. It was perhaps the bravest thing Dane had seen the woman do. In the end, Nora did not approve it. She also did not forbid it. She merely said, "If you find anything, you stop touching it and call me." The old boathouse took longer to reach than it looked on paper. The path ran down through scrub cedar and wind-stunted grass, then along a shelf of rock slick with salt and old weed. Bishop moved ahead on a long lead, not pulling now, but purposeful, as if the route made sense to him in some instinctive register beyond reason. The structure, when they finally saw it, was half hidden beneath a fold of stone and brush. Time had worked on it with patience. Its roof sagged under rot. One side leaned toward the water. Weathered boards had silvered almost white, and rust cliff-shaded the hinges like dried blood. It looked less abandoned than forgotten, as though forgetting had been more useful than demolition. Inside, the air smelled of brine, mold, and old engine oil. There were hooks on the wall where gear had once hung, a broken pulley. A workbench collapsed on one side. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just the exhausted remains of utility. Mara stood near the doorway, arms folded tight across herself. "This is where they took him?" "We don't know that," Dane said. She turned on him so fast, the movement startled even Bishop. "That's your answer to everything, isn't it?" Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The hurt in it was older than volume. "We don't know. We can't prove. It could mean something else." She took a breath that shook once before she mastered it. "My family has lived in that sentence for 30 years. Dane held still. Mara stepped closer. "You keep protecting him inside your head because he once reached back for you. I understand that. I even respect it. But don't ask me to respect the cost of it anymore." That struck deeper than anger would have, because it was precise. Not a condemnation of Brenner alone, of Dane, of the way loyalty could become a hiding place when truth arrived carrying the wrong face. For a long second, the wind and water outside seemed louder than the room itself. Bishop stood between them, ears forward, head lifted, as if reading which human grief to tend first. Then he moved, not to either of them, to the far wall behind the collapsed bench. He began scratching once, twice, then stopped and sniffed low along the baseboard, tail gone rigid. Dane knelt and shifted the broken planks aside. The lower section of wall had been patched at some point with boards that did not match the rest. One nail had rusted through. He pried it free with his knife. The panel came away harder than it should have, then gave with a damp groan. Inside the cavity sat a metal ammunition can wrapped once in oilcloth gone dark with age. No one spoke. Dane set it on the floor. He looked at Mara, then at the doorway, where the water flashed white for a moment beyond broken slats, then back to the can. When he opened it, the hinge let out a sound like a breath caught too long. Inside was a contact sheet from a 35mm roll, sealed in brittle plastic, a dog tag on a tarnished chain, a microcassette in a cracked hard case, and folded beneath them, softened by moisture but still legible, a receipt from a roadside motel 12 miles from Black Alder. The name on it was Cole Thorne. Dane went completely still. Not because the name surprised him. By now, almost nothing did. It was the date that did it. 3 weeks before Cole died. Mara saw it too. Her face changed, not dramatically, but in the terrible inward way grief sometimes renewed itself. "He was here," she said. Dane did not answer. He could not. It was one thing to know Cole had been asking questions, another to realize he had come this far, stood in this same salt-dark place, put his hand on the same hidden can, and then carried that knowledge alone. The dog tag was Gabriel's. The cassette took longer. Dane had to borrow Mara's penknife to free the snapped latch. There was an old microcassette recorder in his truck. He used it sometimes for notes on repair jobs because typing made his hand ache in cold weather. When the tape finally clicked and rolled, static filled the boathouse first, then a man's breathing. Gabriel. His voice was lower than Cole's had been, roughened by fatigue, but the family resemblance sat inside certain words like bone under skin. "If this gets out," he said quietly, "it's because they've already decided I'm the problem." A pause. Distant metal noise. The Calder Frost inventory doesn't match the seizure log. Not even close. Crates marked for disposal are gone for harass. Hollis says it stays in-house until he can control the fallout. Says if it goes outside command, they'll burn the whole site and everybody with it. Another breath. "I took the pictures. If anything happens, A door opened somewhere off mic. Gabriel stopped talking. Then, very faintly, another voice. Male. Controlled. Too blurred to identify. A sentence cut by static. Then the tape snapped into empty hiss. No confession. No theatrical revelation. Just enough truth to wound. Mara wiped at her face with the heel of her hand, angry at tears for coming at all. Dane stared at the recorder and felt something inside him splitting along a line it had resisted for days. Brenner's name, Gabriel's voice, Cole's motel receipt, the hidden can, the old boathouse that should have been gone from record and wasn't gone from the world. None of it fit inside denial anymore. He packaged everything exactly the way Nora would have wanted. Photos first, gloves on, minimal handling. Call placed before they moved the can from the floor. Even in pain, procedure gave the hands something to do. By the time Nora arrived with evidence bags and a case technician, the light had turned copper at the edges. She listened to the tape once in silence, then again with eyes closed, as if hearing might sharpen where machines could not. She bagged Gabriel's dog tag herself. Back at the truck, as Mara sat with her forehead against the passenger window, and Bishop watched the surf through a crack in the rear glass, Dane's phone rang, Frank Delaney. The old man did not sound like himself. His words came blurred, breathless, as if his mouth had forgotten how to shape them properly. "Need you," Frank said. "Come now." Then the line cut. By the time Dane reached the house, the ambulance had not yet arrived. Frank was on the floor as between the recliner and the coffee table. One arm twisted badly beneath him, the left side of his face fallen slack. His skin had gone the color of paper left in rain. Bishop hovered at the threshold, restless but obedient, sensing the medical terror of the room even if he could not name it. Dane dropped to his knees. "Frank, stay with me." One pale eye found him. The other seemed to be looking someplace farther away. Frank's fingers clawed once at Dane's sleeve, then latched hard with surprising strength. The effort to speak traveled visibly through his whole body. He pulled Dane closer. "Not." Frank's mouth trembled around the word. "Not. Order to shoot." Dane bent lower, close enough to smell whiskey in the old man's sweat and the sharp metallic scent of fear. Frank dragged in another ragged breath. "He ordered. Him kept." The last word barely made it out. Then the sirens came, thin and rising from the road below, and Dane held on to Frank's wrist as if grip alone could stop the past from becoming final one more time. The first thing Dane read in Cole's unfinished letters was not accusation. It was apology. Not to the Navy, not to a commanding officer, not even to Mara, to Gabriel. The pages had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had begun to whiten. Some were written in Cole's quick, slanted hand on motel stationery, others on cheap yellow legal pads with whole paragraphs crossed through until the paper looked wounded. Dane sat at his kitchen table long after midnight, the lamp burning low. Bishop stretched on the floor beside him, with one ear twitching in sleep. Outside, the wind moved across the trees in long, cold breaths, and now and then the cabin gave a soft wooden groan, as if it too had old things shifting inside it. Cole had never written like a man trying to make himself noble. That was what hurt most. "I don't need you to have been a hero," one page said. "I just need you not to have run." Another, more ragged and obviously written later, read, "I spent half my life thinking if I stood straight enough, worked hard enough, served clean enough, people would say our name without that pause in it. Dane put the page down and pressed a hand over his mouth. Cole had not gone into uniform because he wanted glory. He had gone because shame had been sitting at his family table since childhood, and he had been trying, in the clumsy, loyal way of sons, to outwork a ghost. Dane knew something about men who built themselves against an invisible sentence. He had just never seen it so plainly in his friend before. There was another line that stayed with him longer than the rest. Maybe the worst part isn't not knowing what happened. Maybe it's knowing people did know and choosing to live beside that anyway. Dane read that one 3 times. By morning, the letters had changed the air inside him, not the facts, the weight of them. He met Nora at the NCIS field office just after 9. She was already moving when he arrived, coat off, sleeves rolled once, a file cart beside her desk. There was a harsher fatigue in her face than usual, as if too many hours had been spent persuading reluctant systems to open their mouths. Her hair was tied back again, and the muscles around her jaw seemed permanently set. "I got partial access," she said without preamble. "Not because anyone wanted me to, because somebody got lazy in the late 90s. She led him into a records room where 2 gray archive boxes sat open on a metal table. Each held procurement forms, disposal logs, transport notices, and contractor authorizations from Black Alder's old operations years. The paper smelled dry and tired. Nora handled it with gloves and the cool patience of a woman who trusted paper more than people, but only slightly. The annex in the photo was connected to an off-book procurement corridor, she said. Not fully invisible, just buried in language boring enough that most auditors would skim it. She showed him the pattern slowly. 1 shipment of confiscated small arms recorded as received. A second form logging the same batch for destruction. Then a third document, filed weeks later under a different reference chain, indicating a smaller disposal count than the original intake. Enough missing to matter, not enough to look theatrical. "Somebody siphoned inventory," Dane said. "Somebody or several people," Nora corrected. "And Calder Frost had an unauthorized civilian contractor presence on site the same night Gabriel disappeared." She slid over a photocopy of the access log. There it was. A Calder Frost badge number pinged at Black Alder after midnight, in a sector that had no reason to host civilian personnel during a sealed transfer. Dane looked up. So it wasn't an accident, not just a bad call. Nora's eyes held his for a beat. "We are past just anything." The trouble with truth, Dane was beginning to understand, was that once it widened, it did not stop at the man who first touched it. It spread along desks, signatures, marriages, reputations, pension files, kitchen tables. It worked the way water did when it got into wood. Quietly at first, then all at once. That afternoon, Evelyn Shaw asked to see them both at the temporary archive trailer. She was standing when they came in, hands braced on the edge of the desk as if sitting had become impossible. She had changed sweaters since the day before. This one was the muted green-gray of sea glass, worn dull with age. On her it made her look more fragile than she was. Her lined face had the strained translucence of a woman who had finally decided to stop hiding inside technical language. "I need to tell you something before you find it somewhere uglier," she said. Nora closed the trailer door behind them. Evelyn took off her glasses and laid them down with great care. "Years ago, after the Black Alder drawdown, I was asked to reclassify several utility schematics tied to the Tidal Annex network. Not destroy them, just relabel them so they'd route through a restricted archive branch and no longer appear in public infrastructure pools." "Who asked you?" Nora said. Evelyn gave a helpless little shake of her head. That is the part I have spent 15 years wishing I remembered more clearly and less honestly. The request came through an administrative chain with command endorsement, high enough that refusing would have been noticed. She swallowed, then went on before either of them could speak. My husband was sick then. Vietnam-era exposure claim. We were fighting for benefits we could not afford to lose, and every form took months. Every mistake cost us another month. I told myself I was moving lines on paper, nothing more. I told myself that if people above my pay grade wanted certain maps set aside, then there was a reason, and it was not mine to question. There were tears in her eyes, but they did not make her look sentimental, only ashamed. I did not know a man had disappeared into that paperwork, she said, but I knew enough to know I should have asked. Dane said nothing. There was blame to be had there, but not clean blame. He could see the younger Evelyn too easily. A tired woman with a sick husband, clinging to a clerical job, and the illusion that obedience was neutral. Nora broke the silence first. Do you still have anything from the original routing package? Evelyn nodded once. One duplicate requisition note. I kept it by accident. Or maybe not by accident. I've never decided. She handed over a thin paper slip, yellowed at the edges. It referenced utilities reassignment tied to restricted annex support, approved under an operations continuity clause. At the bottom were initials rather than a full signature, not proof, but the shape of a corridor. Before anyone spoke again, Bishop, who had been lying by the trailer wall, unusually restless since they arrived, rose and crossed to Evelyn. He did not paw her or whine. He simply sat at her feet and leaned the full weight of his head against her knee. The woman startled, then froze. For a moment she did not look like an archivist or a witness or a link in a compromised chain. She looked like what she was underneath all of it, a tired human being who had carried a small act of cowardice so long it had become heavier than she could admit. Her hand, hesitant at first, came down onto Bishop's neck. The dog stayed there, steady and warm. Evelyn shut her eyes. I think, she said, voice breaking in the smallest place, that I kept that paper because some part of me knew silence was not the same thing as innocence. No one answered immediately. They did not need to. The truth had already entered the room in a different form than evidence. By early evening, Dane received a message from Evan Brenner. My father wants to see you, alone, before tomorrow. Tomorrow was the dedication ceremony. For several minutes, Dane stared at the screen without moving. Bishop, sensing the change in him, rose from beside the stove and stood waiting near the door. The Brenner house sat on a bluff above the water, older than most things in that county, and built in the kind of style that disguised wealth as discipline. No wasted ornament, dark shingles, broad windows. A flag lowered neatly for the evening. When the housekeeper let him in, Dane stepped into warmth, polished wood, and the muted quiet of expensive restraint. Hollis Brenner was waiting in a study lined with framed service photographs and shelves of military history. Age had not softened him so much as narrowed him. He was taller still than most men, even with the slight stoop time had put into his shoulders. His hair, now silver white, was combed back from a long, intelligent face that had grown gaunter without losing authority. His eyes remained their cold, disciplined blue. He wore a dark cashmere sweater beneath a charcoal coat, and he moved slowly, but not weakly, like a man who had learned to spend strength where he chose. Dane, he said. no apology in it. No theatrics. Dane remained standing. Brenner gestured once toward the chair opposite his desk. Sit. I'm fine. A ghost of something crossed the older man's face. Not irritation. Something more resigned. So, Brenner said, easing himself into his own chair, we are here. Dane looked at him and felt two lives pulling in opposite directions. In one, this was still the man who had dragged him out of a kill zone. In the other, this was a man seated at the center of too many shadows to call any of them incidental. Did you know Gabriel Thorne had uncovered the inventory discrepancy? Dane asked. Brenner did not answer immediately. He folded his hands, stared at them for a moment, then lifted his gaze again. Yes, he said. The word fell softly. Dane had imagined denial, anger, a polished speech. He had not imagined that. Did you know he took photographs? Yes. Did you know he intended to take it outside the chain? Brenner exhaled through his nose. Gabriel was not a stupid man, but he was a narrow one. He could see a wrong and only the wrong. He could not always see what would collapse if he pulled the beam out. Dane felt his pulse in his throat. So you buried it. I contained it, Brenner said. There is a difference. Something dangerous moved through Dane then, but he kept his voice low. Not to the people crushed underneath it. For the first time, a flicker of weariness, not performance, not pity, but the genuine burden of old justification, showed in Brenner's face. You were not there in the whole of it, he said. You know one photograph, one recording, one broken line from a frightened corpsman, and you think that equals command reality. He leaned back slightly. If that operation had ruptured publicly when it happened, the training program would have gone under review. Multiple deployments would have stalled. Contractors tied to live procurement would have disappeared into investigations, and every man under that structure would have paid the price whether he knew a thing or not. Dane stared at him. Brenner's voice stayed calm. That calm was the worst part. There are nights, he said, when leadership is choosing which fire is permitted to spread. And Gabriel? A pause. Then Brenner said the thing Dane would hear again later in the dark, in his truck, in the silence before sleep. He did not understand that some things are better kept in shadow. The words were not shouted. They did not need volume. Their horror was in their orderliness. Brenner did not claim innocence. He claimed necessity. And in that instant, Dane understood something colder than guilt. The man across from him had been living with this logic so long that it no longer sounded monstrous in his own mouth. When Dane rose to leave, Brenner spoke one last time. I pulled you out of a place where other men would have left you. Dane stopped at the door. Yes, he said, not turning around. That's what makes this worse. Outside, the wind coming off the bluff had teeth in it. He was halfway down the drive when Mara called. Her voice was strained, sharper than usual, not panicked, furious in the way only the deeply wounded could become when paperwork finally revealed how patiently it had been hurting them. I got the supplemental benefits file, she said. The old one. Gabriel's death status review. Dane stood still beside his truck, one hand on the roof. They delayed survivor benefits twice, Mara said, then froze the final recommendation for almost a year. The approval chain dead ends through regional command liaison, Brenner's office at the time. His office, Dane. He shut his eyes. Across the water, the last of the light was draining out of the sky. This was no longer just about the man who disappeared, or the report that lied about him, or the cargo that vanished. The lie had moved through payroll offices and benefit forms and grocery budgets. It had reached into a family kitchen and thinned the fire there winter after winter. It had made a widow wait longer, children feel smaller, a son spend half his life walking like he owed the world proof. Dane ended the call and stood for a long time in the darkening drive. Bishop, in the passenger seat, watched him through the glass. Back in the truck, Dane did not start the engine right away. He sat with both hands on the wheel and replayed Brenner's voice until the words lost none of their meaning. Not panic, not chaos, not a bad night that got out of hand. A choice. A choice made slowly enough to justify, cleanly enough to live beside, officially enough to survive 30 years. If Hollis Brenner could speak of shadow that calmly, then Gabriel Thorne's ruin had not begun in fear. It had begun in belief. The county had already begun dressing the lie. By the time dawn reached Black Alder, white folding chairs had been arranged in rows beneath a temporary canopy overlooking the water. Flags stood furled in the cold, their fabric not yet awake in the wind. A polished bronze plaque, still covered by a dark cloth, waited near the podium, where men in pressed uniforms would stand tomorrow and use words like duty, sacrifice, and legacy. Workers moved in measured lines across the grounds, carrying cables, floral stands, coffee urns. Everything about it looked clean, official, finished. Dane parked above the site and watched them from inside the truck. Bishop sat beside him in the passenger seat, tall and still, his yellow and black coat catching the pale light in dull bands of gold and smoke. The dog's ears remained forward, but not in alarm. He was listening the way trained dogs listened when something in the air did not match the shape of the place. Dane had come to trust that expression more than his own first instincts. He was still watching when a dark sedan pulled into the gravel lot below, and Evan Brenner stepped out. Evan looked different from the day before. Not ruined, exactly, just less held together by rehearsal. His navy coat hung open over an untucked sweater, and the wind had gotten into his carefully managed hair. At 40, he still carried the composed build of a man raised inside expectations, broad enough through the shoulders to seem grounded, trim enough to suggest discipline rather than vanity. But today, the polish had cracked. His gray-blue eyes, so much like his father's and yet so much softer, had the sleepless redness of someone who had spent the night trying to arrange what could not be arranged. He came to Dane's truck window and waited. Dane stepped out. For a second, neither man spoke. Behind them, workers laughed over something ordinary near the catering tent, and the sound felt almost obscene. "My father asked me not to come," Evan said. Dane folded his arms. And yet. Evan looked past him toward the ceremony site, jaw flexing once. "I'm not here to tell you he's innocent. I'm past that now." The honesty of it landed harder than denial would have. Evan took a breath. "But tomorrow my mother will be sitting in the front row. Men in their 70s and 80s will be there too. Men who built whole versions of themselves around what Hollis Brenner meant to them. Some of them are alive because of him. Some buried sons under flags and used men like my father as the last shape of order they still believed in." Dane said nothing. Evan's voice lowered. "I'm asking you whether truth has to arrive like public execution." The question was fair enough to hurt. Dane looked at him for a long moment. "You think I want this?" "No," Evan said quietly. "That's what makes this worse." Wind moved between them, carrying tar, salt, and the faint metallic smell of fresh scaffolding. "My father did save people," Evan said. "Maybe he also destroyed one. Maybe more. I don't know what to do with both of those things living in the same body." His mouth tightened. "But I know what tomorrow will do to my mother." Dane felt something old and tired shift inside him. Evan was not trying to protect a machine. He was trying to protect a room full of human beings from a blast wave already on its way. That did not make him right. It only made him real. "I can't promise you gentleness," Dane said at last. Evan gave a small, bleak nod. "I didn't come for a promise. I came because if this house collapses, I'd rather not say later that I stayed inside it and called that loyalty." He left without another word. After he was gone, Dane stood watching the ceremony grounds again. The men setting up chairs looked like they were preparing for weather, not judgment. It occurred to him then that institutions rarely felt like villains when you stood close enough to touch them. They felt like schedules, clipboards, polished shoes, decent people doing the next task in line. Bishop whined once, not loud, just enough. "What?" Dane murmured. The dog had turned his head toward the new wooden access platform, extending toward the old tidal edge near the memorial site. Fresh boards, fresh railings, too neat for the rest of Black Alder. Bishop jumped down from the truck and began pulling in that direction with a steady insistence. Dane hesitated only once before following. Mara was already there when he reached the lower platform, standing with her arms folded against the wind, dark parka zipped to the throat. Her chestnut hair had come partly loose, and the cold had put raw color in her face. At 38, she looked like a woman who had spent too many years holding anger in one hand and endurance in the other until both had become part of her posture. She glanced at Bishop, then at Dane. "He started this before you got here," she said. "Wouldn't leave the lower dock." The dock was an awkward thing. Old pilings below, new timber above. Built over the edge of an earlier structure the contractors had never bothered fully to remove. Bishop moved to the far end and lowered his muzzle near the seam where the platform met an older section beneath it. He sniffed once, twice, then pawed lightly at a patch of darkened wood. "Tar," Mara said. "Fresh." Dane crouched. She was right. Not the deep, cured smell of long, weathered pitch. Something newer. And beneath it, another smell. Paper. Damp and boxed in. He looked up at the construction zone. A concrete pour crew had stacked forms nearby for the next day's work. Once the lower edge was sealed, anything tucked inside this platform would be locked under it for years. "Call Nora," he said. Mara already had her phone out. Nora arrived in 22 minutes, angry before she got out of the car. Not theatrical anger, the kind that came from knowing time had just become an adversary. She wore gloves before she reached them. "No one touches anything else," she said. Using a pry bar from the maintenance shed and a contractor as a witness, they lifted the section Bishop had indicated. Beneath the boards, wrapped in tar paper and shoved into the cavity between support beams, lay a weatherproof field notebook, a clipped sheaf of typed pages in a plastic sleeve, and a single folded memo with water damage at the edges. Everything in Dane went still. Nora handled the package first. She set each item out on an inverted crate, while Mara and Dane watched in a silence so taut it felt ceremonial. The notebook was Gabriel Thorne's. There was no need to guess. His name was written on the inside cover in block letters, along with a blood type and an old field phone extension. The pages smelled of mold and salt, and the long patience of hidden things. The handwriting inside was compact, careful, and maddeningly clear. Not the frantic scrawl of a man unraveling. The notes were measured, dated, cross-referenced with inventory codes and transfer marks. He had known exactly what he was looking at. Not rumors. Numbers. Shipment counts that did not match destruction logs. Crate designations rerouted through Calder Frost shell authorizations. Tide window notations. Vehicle IDs times. Names reduced to initials where certainty stopped. And in the back, clipped inside the cover, lay an unsigned after-action draft that had never made it into any official system. Mara read over Nora's shoulder, breathing through her mouth as if air itself had become difficult. "It's all here," she whispered. "Not all," Nora said. "Enough." Near the center of the notebook, Dane found a page folded inward on purpose. He opened it expecting another inventory line, another code, another practical warning. Instead, he found 3 sentences written more heavily than the rest, as if Gabriel had pressed the pen harder there. "I know exactly what this will sound like if they decide to bury me with the cargo. That I was unstable, that I misunderstood command, that I let anger outrun discipline. If anyone ever reads this, know I waited before writing. I verified before accusing. I am not guessing." For a long moment, nobody spoke. It was not a dramatic discovery. No thunder cracked. No hidden name leapt off the page. But it changed something essential. Gabriel had foreseen the shape of the lie they would use against him, and had written calmly into its mouth before it ever opened. The folded memo was shorter, and worse. It had been typed on command stationery, then marked by hand. Most of the header had smeared away, but the order remained legible. Contain Thorn until transfer. No outside chain. Below it, in slanted ink, were initials Nora did not read aloud because she did not need to. Dane recognized the hand before his mind agreed to it. Brenner. Not a confession to murder. Something colder. An administrative act. A clean sentence that cut a man away from lawful daylight and called it procedure. Mara stepped back as if the paper itself had struck her. "This is it," she said, but there was no triumph in her voice, only exhaustion. This is the moment. This is where he was taken out of the world and turned into a problem to be managed. Nora sealed the items with a calm so exact it bordered on mercy. "This is enough to escalate," she said. "Enough to stop tomorrow if it's handled correctly." "If," Dane repeated. Nora looked at him sharply. "Yes, if. Because once this goes upward, they may try to bury it under review timing and legal caution, which is why I need you not to do anything impulsive in the next 12 hours. Dane almost laughed, but there was nothing humorous in him. "The ceremony happens tomorrow morning," Mara said. "By the time review finishes, the speeches are over, the plaques unveiled, and he's history again." Nora met her gaze. "I know." That was the cruel center of it. Procedure was real. So was timing. One did not always arrive in time to save the other. They left Black Alder at dusk. Mara drove home alone with both hands tight on the wheel. Nora took the evidence straight into federal custody. Dane sat in his truck in the parking lot after everyone else was gone, Bishop beside him, and understood that the last excuse had been removed. He could no longer tell himself he was waiting for enough. Enough had come. Night had fallen by the time he reached the Brenner house. No one stopped him. No one pretended not to know why he was there. Brenner was waiting again in the study, but tonight the room looked less like a monument and more like a mausoleum. Lamps were lit low. The old officer stood by the window facing the black water beyond the glass, one hand resting on the back of a leather chair. He turned when Dane entered. Neither man sat. "I assume," Brenner said, "that you found something." Dane held up a photocopy Nora had allowed him to carry of the memo line. Not the original. Just enough. Brenner's eyes went to it and did not widen. That was answer enough by itself. "I'm giving you one chance," Dane said. "Tell me I'm wrong." Brenner was quiet for so long that the clock on the mantel became unbearable. Then he said, "You are not wrong in the way that matters." Something inside Dane gave way, not explosively, but like a beam taking more weight than it could pretend to hold. Brenner's voice, when it came again, sounded tired, not remorseful, simply tired. "I did not kill Gabriel Thorne with my hands," he said, "but I killed him the moment I decided the unit mattered more than the man." Dane stared at him. The old admiral did not dress the statement up. He did not beg context around it. He went on, looking not at Dane now, but somewhere beyond him, perhaps at the younger version of himself he still defended in private. "He wanted to take it outside," Brenner said. "He believed exposure purified things. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it destroys what remains salvageable and feeds the worst people in the room." He lifted his head. "I made a command decision. You isolated him from legal chain." "Yes. You froze his family and paperwork for years." A flicker crossed Brenner's face. Shame, perhaps, or annoyance at being made to look directly at consequences that had once felt administrative. "That was not my original intent. But it happened." "Yes." Dane could hear his own pulse. Could hear Bishop shift once in the doorway behind him, nails clicking faintly on hardwood. For years he had carried Hollis Brenner inside him as proof that courage and command could live in the same man without rot. Now he stood before an older, truer version of that man and saw the rot had not replaced the courage. It had grown beside it. That was the most unbearable part. "You saved my life," Dane said. "I did. And Gabriel?" Brenner closed his eyes for one brief second. "Gabriel became the cost I accepted." There it was. Not panic. Not accident. Not a night gone wrong. A cost. Dane understood then with final clarity that he could not keep the old Brenner alive inside him and still walk tomorrow into the daylight with Gabriel's name in his hands. One man had to die for the other to come back. When he stepped out into the night, the wind off the water felt like something newly honest. Back at his truck, he sat with the keys untouched in his palm, while Bishop settled heavily against the seat, warm and watchful. Down below, unseen in the darkness, the ceremony ground waited for morning. Tomorrow, by this time, the plaque would either be unveiled under a lie or interrupted by truth. Dane looked toward Black Alder, where only a few work lights burned now through the dark. At last he understood that choosing was no longer something he could postpone and call caution. By sunrise, he would either protect the last clean image he had ever had of Hollis Brenner or give Gabriel Thorne his name back. Morning came hard and bright, with a wind off the water sharp enough to make every flag snap like a warning. By 9 o'clock, the Hollis Brenner Leadership Center looked ready for history. Rows of white folding chairs faced a raised platform draped in navy cloth. Brass stanchions gleamed. The covered plaque stood beside the podium beneath a dark velvet shroud, waiting for hands that still believed unveiling and truth were the same thing. Retired officers in pressed coats moved through the crowd with the grave efficiency, men who had spent entire lives making ceremonies look cleaner than the wars behind them. County officials smiled too much. Coffee steamed in silver urns. Somewhere near the back, a high school band tuned instruments in nervous fragments. Dane stood off to one side with Bishop at his leg and tried not to feel like a man attending his own trial. He wore the same old olive tactical shirt he wore for everything that mattered, sleeves buttoned, cuffs softened white at the edges from years of salt, work, and washing. His moss-green combat pants were clean but still scarred at the knees. The boots on his feet had gone with him through more weather than most men admitted to. There was nothing ceremonial about him. That was part of why Brenner's committee had wanted him there. He looked like the kind of man speeches liked to borrow when they needed legitimacy. Mara arrived without hurry. She wore her dark parka zipped to the throat, hair tied back low, face bare, tired, and harder to read than grief usually allowed. There was no dramatic fury in her this morning, just a woman who had spent too many years carrying the dead politely. She stopped beside Dane, looked at the platform, then at the cloth-covered plaque. "That's what they were going to leave standing," she said. Dane nodded once. Nora Keats was already on site, though not as part of the ceremony. She stayed near the edge of the crowd in a charcoal coat, a leather folio tucked under one arm, a phone in her hand. She had slept even less than usual. There was a clean severity to her face today, the kind that came when a person had made up her mind to be exact at any cost. Overnight, she had pushed the evidence through emergency channels, chain of custody review, preliminary authentication, internal misconduct hold, JAG consultation, supervisory sign-off. Not enough to finish anything. Enough to stop a lie from hardening under bronze. Brenner arrived to applause. Hollis Brenner moved more slowly now than the man in Dane's memories, but age had not robbed him of presence. He came across the platform in a dark wool coat, silver hair brushed back from that long, stern face, eyes still pale and intelligent enough to make weaker men straighten when he looked their way. For a brief, ugly second, Dane understood exactly how all this had lasted so long. Brenner still looked like the kind of man history would rather keep. Evan walked beside him, not quite close enough to touch. He had put himself back together for the crowd, navy coat buttoned, jaw shaved, hair combed into obedience, but the night had stayed in his face. The strain around his eyes made him seem older than 40. He did not look at Dane. He looked at the ground between steps, like a man trying not to see the place where his life was about to split. When the introductions began, the words sounded as polished and false as lacquer. Service, courage, legacy, continuity. The master of ceremonies, a county commissioner with a fixed smile and a veteran's lapel pin, spoke into the microphone with warm, practiced reverence. Dane scarcely heard him. He heard the wind, the restless cloth over the plaque, Bishop's steady breathing, and somewhere beneath all of it, Gabriel's voice from the tape saying, "If this gets out, it's because they've already decided I'm the problem." Then the commissioner smiled toward him. "And now," he said, a few words from former Navy SEAL Dane Calloway, whose own life was once saved by Admiral Brenner's extraordinary leadership. Applause again, polite, expectant. Dane walked to the podium. The crowd settled. The water flashed steel blue beyond them. Somewhere in the second row, a veteran in a campaign cap, folded his hands over the cane between his knees and waited to hear the familiar story. Gratitude, honor, inheritance. Brenner sat motionless, one hand over the other, the image of old command. Mara did not sit at all. She remained standing at the back with her chin lifted, as if refusing comfort were the only honest posture left. Dane looked out at the faces before him. County people, old servicemen, wives in dark coats, workers who had come early just to witness importance happen in public. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that people leaned in. I was asked here because Admiral Brenner once saved my life. He let that stand. It's true. He did. The audience seemed to relax, only slightly. Dane's fingers tightened on the sides of the podium. But I've learned something in the last few days that matters more than any debt one man owes another. He looked toward the covered plaque, then back at the crowd. Loyalty without truth in it does not stay loyalty forever. Sooner or later, it becomes pride wearing a uniform. The silence that followed was not loud, but it had weight. It spread in rings through the crowd. Men shifted in their chairs. One woman lowered her program. On the platform, Brenner did not move at all. No one interrupted him. That was the strange part. Not because they agreed. Most of them did not yet know enough to agree, but because somewhere beneath the shock, another feeling had passed through the audience. Recognition. Dane saw it in the faces of two older men in the front row, who did not look outraged, only tired. One of them slowly removed his cap and held it in both hands. The other lowered his eyes before Dane had even said Gabriel's name. In that instant, it became clear that what was being exposed here was not just one man's decision. It was the long American habit of loving clean symbols more than messy facts, especially when the facts asked decent people to admit how much they had needed the symbols. Then Nora moved. She did not rush the stage like a hero. She walked to it the way she had walked into every hard room in this case, with a folder, a bad night behind her, and the discipline to let procedure do the work emotion wanted to do faster. She stepped beside the podium and handed the commissioner a printed administrative order. He scanned it, blanched, and stepped back without argument. Nora faced the microphone. By authority of an emergency federal administrative hold, pending misconduct inquiry, she said evenly, this dedication is suspended. The words cracked across the ceremony more effectively than shouting would have. A murmur surged through the crowd. Someone near the back said, "What the hell is this?" A chair scraped. Evan stood so abruptly, his program fell at his feet. Brenner remained seated a moment longer, then rose with deliberate calm, though something in his face had already gone older. Nora did not look at him first. She looked at the record in her hands. Over the last 48 hours, she said, authenticated evidence has been reviewed linking former command decisions at Black Alder to the unlawful containment of Gabriel Thorne following the incident in which he was reported missing. Gabriel's name moved through the audience like a draft through an old house. For some, it meant nothing. For others, it meant 30 years of rumor suddenly standing up straight. Nora read the chain with brutal precision. The internal detention form logged 18 hours after Gabriel's supposed disappearance. The procurement discrepancy between seized and destroyed weapons. The unauthorized Calder Frost civilian access. The command memo ordering, contain Thorne until transfer, no outside chain. The field notebook. The after-action draft. The delayed survivor benefits routed through Brenner's office chain. Then she held up the recorder. What you are about to hear has been preserved, logged, and preliminarily authenticated. When Gabriel's voice came over the speakers, it did not sound cinematic. It sounded tired, human. A man talking before exhaustion overtook caution. That was why it hurt. People listened without moving. Even the wind seemed to hold off for those few seconds. And when the blurred second voice entered the tape, when the door opened and Gabriel's unfinished warning died into static, something in the ceremony collapsed inward. Not dramatically, simply past repair. Evan had turned pale. He looked not at his father, but at the crowd, as if only now understanding how many lives had been propped on a version of this man. Brenner stepped toward the podium. No one stopped him. He no longer looked imposing. He looked diminished by exact proportions, as if truth had not struck him from outside so much as drained something from within. He stood before the microphone, eyes on the sea beyond the audience, then on Dane, then on no one. I told myself, he said, and even now his voice carried that terrible old calm, that silence would protect the unit, the program, the men beneath it. I told myself the truth would not stop with the guilty, that it would burn through everything. He paused. And over time, he said, more softly, the thing I protected most consistently was my own name. No gasp followed. No theatrical recoil. Just the sound of people learning that confession often arrived dressed as exhaustion instead of thunder. Evan sat down hard in his chair as if his knees had stopped trusting him. Mara put a hand over her mouth, not because this was victory, but because hearing it aloud did not return a single lost year. After that, things happened the way real things happened, with forms, statements, escorts, and witnesses. Nora spoke quietly with the supervisory agent who had arrived near the perimeter halfway through the tape. Brenner was not dragged away. He was asked to remain available for questioning. He agreed, because men like him had always known how to turn ruin into posture. Evelyn Shaw later gave a recorded supplemental statement. Frank Delaney, alive a little longer than doctors first thought he would be, signed his final affidavit from a hospital bed 2 days later and died before the week was out. Gabriel Thorne's status did not change in one dramatic decree. It changed through review, correction, classification reversal, and the slow machinery that should have worked sooner. But it changed. Officially. Permanently. So did Cole. Not in rank or record. In light. People spoke his name differently after that, once they understood the life he had spent pushing against. A man could be dead and still be released from something. It was not fair, but it was real. Weeks later, after the ceremony grounds had been half redesigned and the Brenner name quietly removed from materials waiting for reissue, the plaque was recast, not as a monument to a hero, as a memorial to the Black Alder dead and missing, corrected to include Gabriel Thorne among those dishonored by secrecy instead of by their own conduct. On the morning Mara came to see it, the weather was gentler. The sea had gone soft gray. Bishop walked more slowly now than when Dane had first taken him in, but there was less strain in him too, as though some internal command had finally been released. Under the old oak near the edge of the site, Dane took the tarnished silver locket from his pocket, rubbed the dirt from its hinge one last time with his thumb, and placed it into Mara's hand. She closed her fingers around it without speaking. Neither of them looked toward the memorial right away. They looked at the tree, the roots, the ground that had given up the truth only after men had failed to keep it buried. Bishop lowered himself to the earth with a slow, heavy sigh and rested his chin on his paws. Dane stood beside them, the wind moving over his face, and realized he did not feel triumph. Relief, maybe, in small, honest pieces. Sorrow, certainly. But more than that, he felt the absence of something he had once thought he needed. The myth of a spotless man to stand under. He had lost that. And standing there, with Mara holding the locket and the old dog finally at peace, he understood that sometimes losing the myth was the first truthful thing a person was given. No one had kept the promise for Gabriel Thorne when it mattered. In the end, it was kept anyway. Not by the institution. By a dead son, a living man, and an old dog who refused to leave the lie where it was buried. Here is a closing message in English you can use at the end of the story. This story reminds us that truth may be buried for a long time, but it is never beyond the reach of God. Men may hide things. Institutions may protect their own image. Fear may keep people silent for years. But when the time is right, God has a way of bringing hidden things into the light. Sometimes He does it through courage, sometimes through memory, and sometimes through something as humble and faithful as an old dog who refuses to let the past stay buried. The lesson is simple, but it cuts deep. Loyalty is only holy when it stands beside truth. If loyalty asks us to ignore what is wrong, then it is no longer honor. It becomes pride, fear, or convenience dressed up as duty. Real courage is not just risking your life in battle. Sometimes real courage is choosing truth when truth costs you the image of someone you once admired. Sometimes it is refusing to let the innocent carry shame that never belonged to them. In everyday life, most of us will never face a secret like this one. But we all face smaller versions of it. We stay quiet when we should speak. We protect comfort when we should protect what is right. We tell ourselves that silence keeps the peace, when in truth it often keeps pain alive. This story asks us to look at our own lives and wonder, is there something we have ignored, excused, or buried because facing it would be too painful? And if there is, do we trust God enough to bring it into the light? Sometimes the miracle is not that God removes the pain. Sometimes the miracle is that He gives someone the strength to walk through it honestly. Sometimes the miracle is that He does not let the truth die, even after many years. And sometimes the miracle is that He can still redeem a broken name, a wounded family, and a burden carried for far too long. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments where you are watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most. I would truly love to hear your thoughts. If you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who may need this message today. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and bring light into every dark place you are quietly carrying. May He give peace to the weary, courage to the hurting, and hope to everyone watching.